take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed your weekend. I suspect you probably spent some time talking about the Olympics and watching them, and we're going to talk about that in the second hour for a couple of reasons. First of all, you may have seen the CNN story that said Kim Jong-un's sister is stealing the show at the Winter Olympics. Well, I couldn't resist that one, so I said, CNN, she may be stealing the show, but she's the head of the Department of Propaganda in a country that sends Christians to slave camps and starves its citizens. And there are all sorts of other things I'd like to talk about, as we will in the second hour, not the least of which is also the overused cries of racism. That's the first article we've posted on our website today by John Funn. A number of times has the word racism been used at the Olympics, of all places. So usually we just try to enjoy the pageantry, the ability of individuals to just do things we can't even imagine that any of us would be able to do, and to actually cheer for our countries and for those athletes. But we will spend some time talking about that in the second hour today. Also get into the subject of immigration. I've posted two articles here: a biblical response to illegal immigration and faith leaders in immigration. Some people using some biblical phrases and verses that might need to be considered again. And so we'll get into all of that in the second hour. But just to give us a little bit of a break from all the news and information that we cover so often here on Point of View, I wanted to spend some time helping you understand how to maybe put your life back together. Failure is part of life, and how you react to it is certainly significant. And disasters are a part of life, and how you react to those disasters is, again, going to tell you a great deal about your Christian convictions. And so we bring to the microphone Tom Holladay. He is the senior teaching pastor at Saddleback Church in California. Individual that has been really involved over the years with, of course, all the things that have happened at Saddleback, a purpose-driven church, and all the different aspects of that. He's written about the relationship principles of Jesus, love, powering, parenting, and a variety of others. We're going to spend some time today talking about this book, Putting It All Together, again, when it's all fallen apart, and it is published by Zondervan. We have information about him and the book on our website. And Tom, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be with you.
It is great to hear your story because, as I pointed out just a minute ago, lots of individuals find themselves dealing with some kind of tragedy, some kind of disaster, maybe some kind of failure, however they fall down. So we're going to look at 7 principles for rebuilding your life. But let's give you some credibility. Our listeners in California, especially those that are maybe near the Sierra Nevada area, will know Marysville, California. A number of years ago, you and your wife were part of a congregation at Feather River Baptist Church until something changed your life almost instantaneously. Tell us the story.
Well, we had the floodwaters rise near us in the levees, and they'd said, we think it's probably not going to flood. You're going to be okay. And then a day later, a levee burst and actually flooded our entire town. The whole town was filled with water. The church we were part of was underwater. Our house was under 9 feet of water. We happened to be across town having some dinner on the other side of where the levees were. I'd taken Shonda out for a fine dining experience at a hamburger place, and they told us, you can't get back over. So all we had left were the clothes on our back and the car we were driving. And I tell people we drove our Chevy to the levee, and the levee was dry. That was really our story because that's all that we had left. And I can still remember as we looked at the news reports, my hands shaking with the adrenaline reaction of everything's changed. I mean, inside I thought logically I'm just fine. And I looked down at my hands and I realized maybe this is a bigger deal than I'm logically thinking right now. And so we had to start to rebuild our house and rebuild the city with other people and rebuild our church.
Well, and again, while we talk about rebuilding, the theme of the book is really built on the theme of Nehemiah. And I think any listener that has read through Nehemiah, or any listener that has been in a church, and I would imagine almost every church, if you've been around for a while, you've probably had your pastor preach through the book of Nehemiah because it has so many great lessons. But I never really thought about using that particular set of scriptures to talk about rebuilding, even though, of course, you are talking about rebuilding the wall and the temple and things like that.
In Nehemiah. Yeah, so I've been a pastor for 5 years at this time.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to lead a church. Everybody's needing to rebuild their business, their houses, our church. What was I going to talk to them about? And it was reading through Nehemiah because I thought, well, he built a wall. Maybe there's something in here that could help me. And I came across Nehemiah 2:20, which says, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding." And you know how it is when you come across a verse and it's just like an electric jolt.
Sure.
It's like it's for you in that moment, and you know it's going to carry you through the days to come. And so out of that experience, I began to look in the book for, well, what are the principles? I mean, what did he do, and what can I learn from him? Because I knew I didn't have enough wisdom to pass along to these people, but I figured, well, maybe Nehemiah has enough to help us get through this.
Well, and I sort of feel like it's on two tracks, almost like a railroad track. One track will be what we learn from Nehemiah, the other track of how we apply it in the 21st century. But let's remind ourselves of what he faced, because in Nehemiah 1:3, it talks about those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. That may not necessarily be the extent of what you faced in terms of the flood in your church and your home, but it's certainly a very significant parallel, wasn't it?
It was, and it's 30 years ago now, so obviously God's rebuilt a lot of things in our lives. But in the years since then, I've learned there's a lot of things that need to be put together again. It's not just a house. It's not just a natural disaster. The same principles in Nehemiah apply to a relationship that has to be put together again. In fact, I think that's the number one thing we got to put together again in life, because we live in a fallen world, so theologically things fall apart in this fallen world. But we have a God who's willing to put things together again when we look to him. So it could be a relationship, it could be a business, it could be yourself. Sometimes you're falling apart on the inside, not telling anybody else. And when you look at the principles of Nehemiah, that verse that you just read is sort of the beginning point, which was maybe my biggest surprise, is he didn't just dig right in at the beginning. He did some things first. So the next phrase after what you just read is, he sat down and he mourned and he fasted and he prayed. So he did those three things. And if you're in a place where you need to rebuild, it's likely that you feel like, I'm not sure I have the energy to do this. Because when things fall apart, it takes the energy. When a relationship falls apart, it's taking the energy out of your life. And as a pastor, I've talked to so many people over the years who say, I'd like to put it together again. I just don't have the strength. Well, where you start is just mourn and fast and pray. Mourning is expressing your hurt to God. Fasting is focusing your heart on God. Praying is asking for help from God. In his presence is the place where you're going to get the direction for what to do next.
We're going to take a break, and let me just mention that we have all sorts of links that you can find here today. And Tom Holladay is also known for Drive Time Devotions, a daily 10-minute podcast, 26 million downloads, and so we have some of those links there as well. And if you'd like to join our conversation a little bit later, perhaps you've had to rebuild some things in your life. If you've lived any length of time, of course you have. We're going to come back and talk about some of those 7 principles for rebuilding your life with Tom Holladay, and then with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, last week I talked about the decision by the Department of Health and Human Services to create the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. Because of some of the controversy surrounding it, I wanted to revisit the topic. The division was created to protect doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers from being coerced into participating in activities that violate their consciences. That would include such medical procedures as abortion, sterilization, or assisted suicide. The editors of the New York Times argued that this additional governmental agency was unnecessary. They argued that Christians have unfounded fears about this issue. David French, in a recent response, finds this amusing since the Supreme Court, during the last session, is considering two cases that involve demands by state authorities that Christians violate their conscience. The first is a case by Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop. The state of Colorado wanted to force him to use his artistic talents to design a cake for a homosexual wedding. The second is a case out of California that is attempting to force a pro-life pregnancy resource center to advertise free or low-cost abortions. Both of these cases want to compel Christians to violate their conscience. The New York Times also attempts to characterize the issue as the Bible versus the Hippocratic Oath. Really, it is a battle between constitutionally guaranteed liberties versus liberal progressive public policies. Michael Berry of the First Liberty Institute reminds liberals that not so long ago they believed in conscience protections. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court acknowledged that an individual who was a conscientious objector could claim the status based only on moral objections rather than religious beliefs. Back then, liberals proudly positioned themselves on the front lines of expanding conscience rights. They should do so again today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13, Samson. In theaters February 16. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
As we're giving you kind of a practical application of biblical truth. It's all part of the book, Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart. 7 principles for rebuilding your life. I know some of you like to take notes as we go along here, so you might number 1 to 7. And the first principle we've already sort of been talking around, but let's get into it in a little more detail. Number 1 would find the strength to start. And it seems to me, Tom, that the first issue is that you have to do a little bit of an assessment of where you are. So often when we've talked about leadership, especially on our Wednesday millennial program with Nick Pitts, because his degree is in the area of leadership, we talk about one of the keys to leadership is really have an honest assessment of where you are. Well, there's a sense in which after this particular crisis that you faced, or any crisis, or any discouragement, or failure, or disaster, you really have to kind of sit down like Nehemiah and evaluate what is taking place. And as you point out, there's a time for mourning, there's a time for fasting, and there's a time for prayer. So kind of fill that in a little bit in light of not only of your own experience, but others that you've had a chance to counsel.
Yes, and, you know, I think mourning is the one I've learned the most about because I needed to learn the most about it. I'm not very good at it, honestly. I'm American and I'm a man, so I'm not very good at mourning. Our culture isn't very good at mourning. But you just talked about leadership, and if you take a look at the Old Testament, all the great leaders knew how to mourn. I mean, Mordecai's mourning changed the nation because he was able to mourn. And look at how David mourned and was able to have a heart for God. So the idea that real leaders will never mourn or hurt over anything, we miss out on so much. And in order to rebuild, you have to start with mourning, because until you can express your hurt to God, you can't see the future because you never see past your hurt. And so there's a lot of people stuck in their hurt. We all get stuck in it sometimes, and that's a beginning point. And then fasting is that focusing of attention on God. And I talk to people about, food fast, that's very important. But I wonder sometimes in modern days if an entertainment fast isn't just as important.
Yes.
Because that's what takes such a big chunk of our time. In order for me to be quiet, just quiet, listen to God, fasting from entertainment, turning off the radio. Shouldn't say this on a radio show, but turning off the radio program sometimes, and just being quiet in your car can have a tremendous impact on your life. You're not going to get anything at the beginning. It's going to take some time, but it's a huge part of putting it together again. And then praying is obviously asking for help from God, leaning on, trusting in His help.
So again, those are some very important elements. And as you point out, this is something we see with Nehemiah. It's something that doesn't necessarily come naturally. And as we come to the end of that first chapter, let me just mention that then you also have some very important first steps. Mourning, express your hurt to God, songs for hurting, and then just a whole list of songs, many of which I'd never even thought about, Christian contemporary music that might be of encouragement to somebody who is hurting. Then a section on fasting, focus your heart on God, and then finally prayer, ask for help from God. So I might just mention that this book is something that is about almost 200 pages, and what you've included in the back is 7 weeks for a small group study. So before we go on, let's talk about some of the, if you will, opportunities to take some first steps, as well as the fact that you've made this for not only an individual to go through, but also for a small group to go through.
Well, yeah, I realize that if we're going to put this into practice in our lives, we've got to put it into practice. So with mourning, for instance, I know that for myself and many others, music has the power to speak to the heart in ways that our logic can't. And it has the power to actually communicate God's word into our heart in ways that we can't in any other way. So, you know, we've all had this experience of we've had a hurt in our lives and we're listening to a certain song and we start weeping. And it might be even months later or even a year or two later, somehow it hit our heart. So I've just given some practical ideas like that through the book to help people with what are some things that you can do about what we're talking about. And I'm glad you mentioned the small group study at the end, because I found if I'm going to see God work changes in my life, it's usually not going to be alone. It's going to be with other people who are praying for me, encouraging me. So I just included the studies in the back of the book instead of having to buy another book, and I put some videos that go along with it up on YouTube so people can watch it there. So all they need is the book, and they can get one person in their family, or they can get a whole small group of 8 or 10 people and walk through the truths together.
So again, a lot of great resources available in this book, putting it together again when it's all fallen apart. And the first step, number 1 on your list, is find the strength to start. Number 2, take the first step. But again, the first step holds the promise of what is to come. Talk about taking that first step.
Well, I haven't been a pastor for decades now, about 40 years. I know the complexity of relationships. And I know sometimes in a relationship, the other person, even if you take the first step, isn't going to respond to you. But I also know how many marriages have failed just because one person wasn't willing to say, I think maybe this could work, to have the courage to be rejected. And if somebody had just said that at the right time, that marriage could have been saved. I know how many parents and children haven't talked, not just for months, but for years.
Yes.
Because nobody will pick up the call and take that first step. They might reject you. I've had a struggle in my relationship with my dad, who struggled with mental illness all his life. So I know what it's like to be on the other side of a call of rejection and have to wait and call again and wait and call again. I didn't want to do it, but taking that step of faith often rebuilds things in ways that you just couldn't imagine.
Yes. Well, again, some great material, but I'll keep it moving because I want to go through all 7. So chapter 3 is appreciate others. Now, Tom, right off the bat, people are going, what? Where does that fit in there? I mean, okay, take the first step, have a plan, go get the plan, get it done, get the resources, appreciate others. Where does that fit into that? But again, if we're going to use Nehemiah as our foundation, we see that actually you have one page with just a whole list of individuals that actually deserved an appreciation. So talk about why that's so important.
Well, any rebuilding you're going to do is going to be a long project. You're going to have energy for it. It's not a week. Rebuilding usually is a matter of years, something that's very significant. So how do you keep energy up along the way? And one of the big ways to keep energy in life is to thank others. There's something about appreciating God, appreciating others, that energizes us for everything that we need, which is the perfect time for me to say, I've been looking for a place, Kerby, to say this, how much I appreciate you. I have benefited as a pastor many, many, many times from you taking the time to biblically think through things. And I just want you to know that for many years now, I have appreciated and benefited from your ministry. So when I tell you that, hopefully that gives me some energy and some strength, and taking the time to do that, I hope it encourages you too. That's what happens.
That's so
What
good.
I've found personally is the best time to appreciate someone is when I'm feeling unappreciated. Turn it on its head, and instead of having a pity party, I look for somebody to appreciate, and that re-energizes me for whatever God has in front of me.
And again, that section on my first steps, be specific in your appreciation, be sensitive in your appreciation, be searching in your appreciation. Just some great resources that are actually listed there as well for appreciation. So now chapter 4, the one I think many people would expect, that is expect and reject opposition. Now, we got some of these individuals that Sanballat and Tobiah that are a good illustration in the book of Nehemiah. But if you are in the ministry that you or Rick Warren are in, or in mine, you really don't want to read my emails. You really don't want to hear some of the kinds of things people say to you.
You don't want to read your emails. I get it. But you do, because you care about people.
So again, if you're going to cast a vision, if you're going to really begin to change the status quo, there's going to be opposition, isn't there?
The person who stands up and says, I think something can happen here, I think God can do something here, whether it's in a relationship or a business or a ministry or in a culture, is the person who's going to get attacked. And there's all kinds of attack that Nehemiah faced. I think the first attack that he faced is one that often surprises us, because we think, if I'm going to rebuild something, everybody's going to be for me, everybody's going to be with me. First thing he faces is ridicule. And so instead of people saying this is going to work, they tell him why it's not going to work. And if you say I'm going to rebuild a relationship, there's going to be some people in your life who ridicule you for that. And it's probably because of their own hurt. They've tried to rebuild a relationship or failed to try to rebuild a relationship. And so they've got hurt, and they want to attack you to sort of bring you back down to their level, because what you're doing is a little bit convicting to them. Let's just be honest. So in the book of Nehemiah, they ridicule them as, they're building a wall that even if an animal climbed on it would fall down. If you try to rebuild a relationship, people look at you and say, well, that'll never work. Or they'll often couch it in humor. You say, I'm going to rebuild my career, and they say, what career? Flipping hamburgers? And they act like it's supposed to be a joke, but this sarcastic humor that we have in our culture many times really comes from this desire to ridicule people, to bring people down.
That's
in
right.
Australia, they call it the tall poppy syndrome. Anybody who puts their head up a little bit, you want to cut it off, because it's a little scary to see that maybe I could dream. Maybe I could see God do more things in my life than I thought.
Well, we're going to take a break and talk about some of the other ways in which you have people begin to reject or oppose you. There's a lot more to cover in the book, Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart. We'll be back right after this.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, from his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters February 16. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of point of view is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without point of view, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoint's commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation today. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or else feel free, just sit back and take some notes. Again, I suggested you might number 1 to 4, and then we'll get on to 5, 6, and 7. First of all, number 1, find the strength to start. Number 2, take the next step, or the first step, if you will. Number 3, appreciate others. And number 4, expect and reject opposition. And we are talking today, of course, with the author of this book, Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart, Tom Holladay. And Tom, we talked about one of the reactions is ridicule. Yeah, you're never going to get that done, or you're going to restart your career flipping hamburgers. But then that gets into some others, everything from attack to discouragement to distraction. Talk about some of those other ways in which we face opposition.
Well, once people find out they can't ridicule you and stop you, they'll start to attack you. They'll start to find practical ways to keep you from getting it done. They'll ridicule you when they feel like you're not going to really do it. But once you really start to show the first progress, and then they start to line up other people's opinions against you, or they start to do some practical things that might keep you from rebuilding maybe that business. Let's make sure you don't get a business license. Whatever it might be, that begins to happen. But then at the end of it is distraction. Once we really begin to rebuild something, we're just human beings. We so easily get distracted away from what's really important. And so the opportunity in that is to say, okay, Lord, I got to spend some time with you each day just to remind myself of what's really important. I've found in my own life, if I don't do that on a daily basis, it is so easy to get distracted away, not necessarily by bad things, but by good things that aren't the right things that I need to be doing in my life.
And that's, I think, part of the problem that you alluded to just a minute ago in terms of mourning and prayer and everything else. It has always been hard to rebuild. But I think it's even more difficult in the 21st century because we have so many more distractions, not the least of which those things that you keep in your pocket or your purse called smartphones. And, and we're just in this 24/7 sort of almost news cycle. And be still and know that I am God. Well, where does that happen? We just don't even have that kind of world anymore. So I think in some respects, it's always been hard to rebuild. It's always been hard to have a God-honoring life. But I would have to say that these technological devices make it even more difficult. What are your thoughts?
Well, yes. And if I can take a turn for just a minute, we live in a culture that's a throwaway culture. Why rebuild when I can just buy it again on Amazon for less than I bought it for the first time? Why redo it? And that often goes to ministry and even relationships. We have throwaway relationships. So why rebuild? The reason you rebuild is because of the incredible value that God puts on our lives and on our relationships and what he's doing in our lives. One of the things I studied for this book was the Sistine Chapel because I wanted to study the great art restoration projects in history. And I found out something I didn't know. I added up all the painting time it took Michelangelo and others to paint in the first place. It took about 12 years to do the Sistine Chapel. The recent restoration took 14 years. So it took longer to restore than build in the first place.
Good line.
But you wouldn't just take white paint and paint it over the Sistine Chapel and paint something new because it's priceless. And what I want people to understand is your marriage is priceless to God. The dream that he put into your life, it's priceless to God. That's why he wants to rebuild it, because what he wants to do out of it is going to bring new beauty, new color into all that he wants to show in his glory in your life.
Yes. Well, and again, as a pastor, you're well aware of the fact that when we have many of these, if you will, no-fault divorce laws, that it just takes one person to say, I give up, whereas before there was sort of...
It breaks my heart.
Yes.
The statistics go up and down, but it's pretty clear that the divorce rate in the church is just about the same as outside the church, and that is heartbreaking. And it says to me, we're not understanding how much God values the marriage. I understand that there's abuse in marriage. I understand that there's some situations and relationships that there are biblical reasons for divorce. I do understand that. But I also know, like you just said, how often we just tend to let it slip away.
Well, again, we've talked about those first four. Let's look at a couple more because, again, 4 was expect and reject opposition. But number 5 is build on your successes. Now, the problem, Tom, for some people is to say, well, I've been a failure all my life. Well, that's not really true. Just the fact that you're here right now means you've had some successes. So certainly we can come in with a very pessimistic view. But at the same time, what you're really saying is that we should be a good steward of the successes that God has given to us. Talk about that.
Yeah. Successes are not a pinnacle to stand on. They're a foundation to build on. Successes are not a trophy that I put up on my shelf and say, wow, look at what happened. How I built that business or how I built my family. Maybe you had a successful family, and you're very grateful for that now that your kids are off to college or they're grown. Well, that's not just for you to be impressed by. God did that in your life for a reason. And the reason is so that you can build into other people's lives. Every success is a stewardship, and every stewardship is a ministry to other people or a way to serve other people. We mistake sometimes. We want to celebrate in a way that mistakes the fact that God wants to use those successes. And then I've met people who, once they have a success, they just want to go on to the next thing. We get a little bit bored with things, and we think, well, yeah, I'm great at that now. I'm going to go become great at something else. And to me, as I've watched how God works in our lives, that's a huge mistake, because the things that God has built over the years in your life, He wants to use those in your life right now. So if you become great at communicating to others, then even though you might want to try something else because you've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, guess what? What God built in your life in that, He wants to use it to continue to bless the world.
What is the place of others in this situation? You know, there's a place where Nehemiah actually decides to then appoint workers, and you talk about the fact that you don't do it alone. And I've had people on this program say that anything that I accomplished that had any significance or led to any kind of success was done as part of a team. Now, we are kind of this individualistic Lone Ranger kind of Christian in North America, but even Lone Ranger had Tonto. So, I mean, even there, we don't exactly have this Lone Ranger mindset, even in the stories that we use to tell that. But it seems to me that we really need to begin to think about a team that can encourage us, hold us accountable, and allow us to really, in a sense, leverage all of what God wants us to do in our lives.
Yeah, this is the leadership lesson part of this. You know, I've been at Saddleback for 27 years now, since we were in high school, so seeing the church grow and grow and grow. And in many ways, it was more fun in the early days because you got to do a lot of things yourself. You didn't have to pass as many things along and delegate them. But the church couldn't have grown and reached people for Christ that it has reached if we had not been willing to let some things go and delegate some things. So there comes a point in your life where you have to decide, what's God wanting to do here? And it's not just about how much I may want to enjoy this. What does He want to do to bless the world through this idea? And many times that means that you have to delegate to somebody else. Many times it means you have to do something even harder as a leader. It means you have to let something go, something you love to do. When I talk to leaders about letting things go, at first that's awesome, because there's some things I want to let go of, I hate doing. But if you're going to really grow in leadership, you got to, at some point, let go of some things that you love to do. Mm-hmm. And being here that long at Saddleback, I've had to do that again and again and again, and I hated it every time. I mean, it's not something you want to do, but when you let go of that, that means somebody else can serve, and it also means God can open up some new doors for you to serve. What I found, though, is He doesn't open up those new doors until I let it go. That's a huge moment of faith that maybe somebody listening right now needs to take. There's something you need to let go of in terms of holding on to too much in your business, or maybe a pastor in your ministry. When you let go of it, let other people get involved in it, God's going to open up some new doors in your life.
Well, again, some great material there. Don't do it alone. Let it go. Another one, put it to use. And each one of these chapters, as I mentioned, have some first steps on how to secure your investment. Don't do it alone. Let it go. Put it to use. Some really great resources that are available. And let's take a break. We'll come back and finish off the last two, 6 and 7. But as we go to a break, let me first of all mention that in the back of the book are 7 weeks for a small group study. So there is a great opportunity for you to begin to think about, since we're talking about don't do it alone, maybe this rebuilding is something you want to do as part of a team. Maybe you want to rebuild a Sunday school class. Maybe you want to rebuild a men's ministry in the church. Maybe you have partners that have not exactly been able to be successful in business, and you want to rebuild the business. So there's an opportunity here for you to actually go through a 7-week study with this book. And again, if you're just joining us, the book is entitled Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart. 7 Principles for Rebuilding Your Life. It is published by Zondervan. And as we come back from the break, just before we wind down, we'll talk about some of the other links that we've provided here as well, so that you can find out a little bit more about Tom Holladay. And, of course, if you would like to order the book, you probably can find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have a place for you to get it both on paperback and in Kindle. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. News out of Minneapolis reports of an aspiring teen boxer granted a religious accommodation. Amaya Zafar is a 16-year-old boxing protege that for some time has had her sights set on representing the United States as a boxer at the 2020 Olympics. But current rules place her in the position of having to choose between her faith and her sport. USA Boxing, however, has solved the problem for the St. Paul teenager by accommodating her faith in the ring. As a result, Zafar will be permitted to keep her arms and legs covered with long sleeves and leggings as her faith requires. That's a simple solution, and while I don't share Zafar's religious beliefs concerning clothing, I do support efforts by anyone, USA Boxing included, to take reasonable steps to respect the religious beliefs of Americans whenever possible. Of course, Zafar is not the first boxer to need a religious accommodation. Cassius Clay, better known as Muhammad Ali, famously asserted his religious beliefs as grounds for conscientious objection to the Vietnam War. In other sports-related cases, we are working to protect the right of Coach Joe Kennedy to pray silently at the 50-yard line when the game is over. Meanwhile, in Florida, we are defending the right of a football team at a Christian school in Florida to be able to pray over the loudspeaker prior to kickoff. As these stories remind us, religious liberty impacts every area of our life, including sports. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Tom Holladay with us as we talk about his book, Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart, 7 Principles for Rebuilding Your Life. The last two, number 6, is Celebrate to Sustain Your Joy. And I love your line there, intense determination without celebration becomes your downfall. Now, we all know, Tom, that in the church we say, well, we're supposed to be humble. We're not supposed to celebrate. We just, actually serve the Lord. But there is a sense in which we need something to actually give us a marker, a chance to celebrate some success. That's a motivating factor. And so that's one of the reasons why you included that as one of those 7 principles.
Yeah, it's where you get the energy from as you're moving ahead is celebration. So I say don't wait to celebrate. A lot of times we think, I'll get to the end of the project, we'll rebuild whatever, the business, the marriage, the house, we'll rebuild it, and then we'll celebrate. Well, you need the energy all the way along the way, so you celebrate all the way along the way. And you can celebrate everything, the Scripture tells us. God's given us all good things to enjoy, because the center of celebration, all celebration, is worship. Everything that we celebrate is made by God. So if you're celebrating your kid's goal at a soccer thing, let's go out afterwards. Well, who made them? Who made you to enjoy them? The fact that everything is made by God, given to us by God, means that the center of all celebration is worship. So it starts with our worship of Him. And when you talk about celebration in the book of Nehemiah, that gets to probably the most familiar verse in the whole book, which is, the joy of the Lord is my strength.
Right.
Nehemiah 8:10, that's what you hang on to. Where are you going to get strength? Well, the joy of the Lord is my strength. And the key thing about that verse to me is it's not the joy of me that's my strength. It's the joy of the Lord.
Yes.
I find a lot of people are trying to manufacture joy somehow from within, and then they just end up more tired at the end. They feel like they should be joyful. They're trying to make themselves joyful, but you can't, because it's the joy of the Lord that's your strength. So you begin, where does that come from? You begin by recognizing what God's given you that can never be taken away. There's some things in our lives we've got to be grateful for that won't last into eternity, but that's not what your joy is based on. Your joy is based on things that can never be taken away. So the love of the Lord, the grace of the Lord, the promises of the Lord, all those things that you know are going to last through this life and last all the way into eternity, when you recognize those gifts, that floods your heart with joy, and then that's what becomes your strength.
So again, you talked about celebration. The last one really is dedication. That is number 7, dedicated to God. What is dedicated to God is what will last. And that is important as well, because as you are entering into and eventually even completing your rebuilding, you're, of course, dedicating it from start to finish to the Lord, aren't you?
Well, yeah, and you see a lot of people, sadly, who rebuild only to see it fall apart again. I've seen so many people who've rebuilt a marriage, and then 2 years later it falls apart again, or rebuild a business and it falls apart again, or rebuild even their faith, their habits in faith with the Lord, and then they run into a wall and they walk away again. And I think, what happened? And I think one of the keys is what we're talking about here, and that's dedication. So in order for anything to last, it has to be dedicated to God. Not to me, but to God. Sometimes the reason you rebuild the marriage is because you're ashamed that it failed, or you're prideful that you want to make sure you can prove that it can work. And that kind of motivation doesn't last. I think it's important to remember the difference between determination and dedication. Determination is how you do it, like the grit and the energy. Dedication is who you do it for. And what lasts is doing it for the Lord, as you just said. So anybody listening right now, you might want to just have like this dedication ceremony in your mind, and whatever you want to last in your life, dedicate it to God. Dedicate your business to God, dedicate your marriage to God, dedicate your life to God, because that's how things last.
Just before we run out of time, let's talk about what is available on your website. We have a link to drivetimedevotions.com, and I might mention, of course, that you teach a daily 10-minute podcast at Drive Time Devotions, but talk about what they will find, what our listeners will find when they land on the website.
Well, it's a free resource from Saddleback Church. It's a ministry of Saddleback Church, and I teach through a book at a time, usually a chapter a week, and 10 minutes a day. So if you want to walk through what the Bible has to teach you, I taught it that way. I did it a lot that way for men. Anybody can listen to it, but a lot of men that I knew weren't studying the Bible, and I thought, how can I help them? So I told them, well, could you just turn off talk radio? Could you just turn off sports radio for 10 minutes in the car in your commute, listening to some Bible, and then move on? And I found that obviously it's captured their hearts, because the Scripture has the power to change our lives. So I've taught through most of the Bible now, all the New Testament, most of the Old Testament, in the last 10 years in doing that. It's been one of the great joys of my life.
And again, there is a Drive Time app, and so that's a resource that is available. But just before we let you go, let's talk about the book one more time. Almost 200 pages, 7 weeks if individuals wanted to actually have a small group study. So whether you're an individual or maybe you're with a group that would like to begin to think about how to rebuild some important parts of their life, talk about how we can use your book more effectively.
Well, Kerby, I wrote the book mostly for the person who needs to get started. So I want to go back to the beginning, to that person who's feeling like, I'd like to do it, but I just can't do it. I don't have the energy. I don't even know if God can give me the energy. I've prayed so many times. It hasn't worked. And I want to encourage them just to pick it up as just for that first chapter, if nothing else, and then see what God does out of that. Because when you start with mourning and fasting and praying, you start with God's presence in your life. I found many, many times He wants to do miracles above and beyond what we can ask or imagine, as Ephesians tells us. So that person right now who's feeling like that they hate me right now for even saying there's a possibility to rebuild, even opening that door right now, I'm hopeful you'll pick it up just for that word of encouragement in your life.
Well, again, I think it will be an encouraging book. It will be one that might give you a road plan or a map to begin to understand what the appropriate steps are. And really for pastors out there or Sunday school teachers, if you have been thinking about teaching through the book of Nehemiah, this is going to be a great resource for you as well, so that you can begin to think about how you can use these principles in the Old Testament and apply those still important biblical principles to the 21st century. So I really appreciate you writing the book. And Tom, thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Privileged to be with you, very much so.
I might mention again, forward by Rick Warren. Please say hello to him as well. We look forward to the next opportunity. Let's, if we can, take a break, and when we come back, we have lots to cover. First of all, we're going to get into the Winter Olympics, and I did mention at the outset CNN's report. Kim Jong-un's sister is stealing the show at the Winter Olympics. Maybe she is, but can we remind ourselves of what it is like to be a believer in North Korea, as we have talked with our friends at various ministries, but let's just use Open Doors as a good example, that every year at the top of the list of the most hostile individuals and hostile countries to actually Christianity and to any kind of religious faith, top of the list, North Korea. And the fawning that was taking place, certainly that's part of it. We'll get into some other aspects of that, and I'll read just a couple of the other tweets, not just mine, but some from people like Eric Metaxas and Jonathan Last and Ed Stetzer, to mention just a few. Then we'll talk about what has been taking place in the Olympics in terms of the way in which there's been almost a fawning coverage of North Korea, and then a complete dismissal of the Vice President, Mike Pence, while he's been there. Then we'll get into, who would have thought that racist comments would have shown up at the Olympics, but I guess there's just no venue that is immune from that. Then we'll get into some other topics as well, so if you'd like to join us in this second hour, we certainly encourage you to do so. But let me also encourage you to go to the website. If you'd like to know a little bit more about this book, you can find that on our website. My commentary today is on conscience protection. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second hour. And, of course, if you would like to listen to the interview again, you can click on that button that says watch or listen. And I hope you'll also consider what you might do to support this ministry so we can keep it going and we can continue to encourage you and educate you. We have a lot to cover in the second hour. We'll do that right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk a little bit about the Olympics in a way that I didn't think we were going to be talking about. If nothing else, figured we would be on Monday celebrating, how about this, a 17-year-old who said he was having a bad day, goes out there and wins the first gold medal in the Winter Olympics. And, you know, great story, fun story there. But I do want to talk about a few things that relate to some of the topics we address here on Point of View. And that is, of course, there was an attempt to bring North Korea to South Korea. And I wondered how much of a PR effort that was. Well, we didn't have to wait long because, as I mentioned in the first hour, and if you receive anything that I put up on Facebook or Twitter, you've probably seen it over the weekend, where there was this article that comes out from CNN. Kim Jong-un's sister is stealing the show at the Winter Olympics. Well, a lot of us had something to say about it. I said, CNN, she may be stealing the show, but she is the head of the Department of Propaganda in a country that sends Christians to slave camps and starves its citizens. Our good friend Eric Metaxas put it this way, said, this is the evil reality of Kim Jong-un's North Korea. This was a young man, an American citizen. CNN, please remember this. And he's quoting from James Hassan, who talks about this is what happened to Otto Warmbier. You might remember it says Otto had a shaved head. He had a feeding tube coming out of his nose. He was staring blankly into space, jerking violently. As we looked at him and tried to comfort him, it looked like someone had taken a pair of pliers and rearranged his bottom teeth. This is just one example of what we can see from North Korea. So many of those happen behind the scenes, but that is the case. Here's what Jonathan Last said. No one else picked up on this. When Kim Jong-un's sister says she looks forward to reunification, well, that's not an overture. It's a threat, because the idea is on the guest book said that she looked forward to reunification. Well, if you're from North Korea, you believe that reunification means what? We will bring South Korea under North Korea's rule. And then I thought just maybe one more, because Ed Stetzer also had something to say about those North Korean cheerleaders. Maybe you've seen those as well. He says those North Korean cheerleaders are impressive because USA Today, in this case, said North Korea cheerleaders make quite an impression at the Winter Olympics. Well, Ed Stetzer said, well, those North Korean cheerleaders are impressive. I bet they practice a lot so that they don't make mistakes, since mistakes in North Korea can get your family tortured and killed. But yes, they're making an impression. So it seems as if some of the mainstream media has had a little difficulty reminding themselves of the fact that, okay, yes, there are some people that are making quite an impression. There are some that are putting on quite a show, but there's a price to pay if you don't. And there is an individual or two here that was complicit in the murder, for example, of her brother. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Here's what our friends at the Wall Street Journal had to say. They said the Winter Olympics are underway in South Korea, and the big winner is North Korea. Thanks to an appeasing government in Seoul and a gullible Western media, the prison state in Pyongyang is getting a public relations makeover worthy of the 1936 Summer Games in Berlin. Remember, those were the ones that were held in Berlin with Adolf Hitler watching over that particular area as well. And, of course, they then, quote from CNN saying Kim Jong-un's sister is stealing the show. This story was an encomium to the heretofore undetected charms of North Korea's first sister, who is North's lead emissary to the games. And it says that with a smile and a handshake and a warm message in South Korea's presidential guest book, Kim Jong-un has struck a chord with the public just one day into the games, said the story. Seen by some as her brother's answer to America's first daughter, Ivanka Trump, who is not only a powerful member of Kim Jong-un's kitchen cabinet, but also a foil to the perception of North Korea as antiquated and militaristic. And so I love the editors of the Wall Street Journal that said, the North Korean Ivanka. What she's wearing, Amani Privé, does she keep the youthful, glowing complexion on a starvation diet? And he says the Western media has gone gaga for the North Korean cheerleaders waving flags in sync at the hockey game. A tweet from NBC Olympics showed a video of the red dress Reds with the caption, "This is so satisfying to watch." Yes, and if any of them gets out of line, her family could be sent for an extended stay in one of those exquisitely outfitted villas at a work camp, perhaps with a lovely mountain view. They're being a little bit sarcastic, as you can imagine, but you've got to begin to wonder when it might dawn on some of these people who are actually covering this, that this is North Korea. This is the hermit state. This is the country which we have talked about on this program time and time again, is perhaps persecuting more Christians by percentage than anywhere else in the world. And yet here it is again to that situation. Well, again, the editors go on to say, but back to the charming Kim Jong-un, whose smile was contrasted with the white male visage of Vice President Mike Pence, who led the U.S. delegation. Philip Bump, a Washington Post reporter, tweeted a photo with Miss Kim looking from behind at Mr. Pence with a caption, "Kim Jong-un's sister with a deadly side eye at Pence." You go, girl, they said. Bump has since pulled the tweet, but his willingness to favorably contrast a member of the despotic family clan with an American vice president was typical of the weekend's Olympics coverage. They go on to say that, for the record, Ms. Kim's brother ordered the murder of their half-brother last year using a VX nerve agent at the Kuala Lumpur airport, then held Malaysian diplomats hostage until Malaysia turned over Pyongyang's agents who plotted the assassination. And in 2013, he killed his uncle with anti-aircraft fire. You don't really want to be part of this family, do you? The media's dictatorship indulgence might not matter if it didn't seem to be lavishing and having such diplomatic consequences for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. South Korean President Moon Jae is treating Miss Kim like a visiting princess, and she invited him to visit them in North Korea, which the global press treated as a genuine breakthrough for peace. They go on to say, never mind that North Korea staged a military parade the day before the Olympics open, showcasing a new ballistic missile, or that North Korea still insists that it will never negotiate over nuclear weapons or the missiles it now launches over Japan. And they go on to say that Mr. Moon deserves much of the blame for this week's charade. He set the tone by inviting Ms. Kim and North Korea head of state Kim Jong-nam to sit with him at the opening ceremony. He then invited them to a presidential mansion the following day, opened the door to summit invitation. Mr. Moon didn't immediately accept, but the offer is an attempt to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea and secure concessions for Mr. Moon, who suspended sanctions and paid the North's expenses to secure its participation in the Olympics. The invitation opens the door for more propaganda blaming the United States tensions created by the Kims. That is not a good way to cover this terrible regime in North Korea. But I'd love to get your comments. Perhaps you saw some of the coverage. NBC, USA Today, Washington Post, CNN. Any comments? 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, last week I talked about the decision by the Department of Health and Human Services to create the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division. Because of some of the controversy surrounding it, I wanted to revisit the topic. The division was created to protect doctors, nurses, and other healthcare providers from being coerced into participating in activities that violate their consciences. That would include such medical procedures as abortion, sterilization, or assisted suicide. The editors of the New York Times argued that this additional governmental agency was unnecessary. They argued that Christians have unfounded fears about this issue. David French, in a recent response, finds this amusing since the Supreme Court, during the last session, is considering two cases that involve demands by state authorities that Christians violate their conscience. The first is a case by Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop. The state of Colorado wanted to force him to use his artistic talents to design a cake for a homosexual wedding. The second is a case out of California that is attempting to force a pro-life pregnancy resource center to advertise free or low-cost abortions. Both of these cases want to compel Christians to violate their conscience. The New York Times also attempts to characterize the issue as the Bible versus the Hippocratic Oath. Really, it is a battle between constitutionally guaranteed liberties versus liberal progressive public policies. Michael Berry of the First Liberty Institute reminds liberals that not so long ago they believed in conscience protections. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court acknowledged that an individual who was a conscientious objector could claim the status based only on moral objections rather than religious beliefs. Back then, liberals proudly positioned themselves on the front lines of expanding conscience rights. They should do so again today. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
From PureFlix, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges, Samson. Rated PG-13, Samson. In theaters February 16. Information at samson.movie.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Take some of those phone calls in just a minute. One of the things I put on the table as a discussion point is how the mainstream media is covering North Korea and what an incredible makeover has been taking place. But I wanted to get to another issue. It's the first article we've posted here by our good friend John Funn. John Funn used to be at the Wall Street Journal, now is at National Review, and he calls it overused cries of racism make it harder for us to unite. Now, he uses the Olympics as a starting point, but he's going to go beyond those for just a minute. But it has to do with the fact that this word racism has shown up a couple of times in the Olympics. Either from individuals that are feeling that they have been slighted or by those who maybe made comments and then were called racist. And you've heard me say this before, but I guess it's worth saying again. When everybody's a racist, nobody's a racist. When you throw the term racist around so often, then when you really do encounter somebody who really is a racist and deserves the title, it doesn't have the same effect. Like I said before, if you call everybody a Nazi, you're minimizing, first of all, what the Nazi regime did. And more importantly, after a while, if everybody gets called a Nazi, nobody's a Nazi. And that doesn't make any sense. So there are some really important issues to look at here. But first of all, let me just give you a little bit of what John Funn has to say. He says, every time you think there's nothing left, no area or topic where race can be injected into the conversation, you're wrong. An African-American skater on the U.S. Olympic team refused to attend the opening ceremonies because of the results of a coin toss that decided whether he or a white female skater would represent the United States at the ceremony. When I first heard that, I was sure that had to be wrong. I just can't imagine that. Well, it turns out it is. The skater is Shawnee Davis. And he said the coin toss was dishonorable, even though, as John Funn points out, it was a previously agreed upon method for breaking a tie vote among U.S. athletes. Davis included the hashtag Black History Month 2018 in his tweet, along with a list of his accomplishments that said he should be made the flag bearer. Now, we could make a very good case for him for, first of all, how successful he has been. The fact that he is African-American might send a good signal. It might even encourage other African-American or Hispanic-American kids to consider looking at the winter sports. So, I can make the case there. But the problem is that Davis was alleging that the first racially motivated coin toss in Olympic history should not have happened. Well, anyway, John Funn goes on to say race also factored in another Olympic controversy last week. And this comes, maybe you've seen this, from John Moody. Now, who's he? Well, he's the vice president of Fox News. I'll give you a warning. He's going to say something I wouldn't have said, but that's okay. Is he racist just because he said it? And what he was doing is he was reacting to, again, one of these Washington Post stories where in the Washington Post story, the U.S. Olympic Committee officials were talking about the diversity gains that they've made in this year's Winter Olympics. Let's face it. Lots of white faces, lots of Anglos, lots of Swedes, lots of Norwegians, lots of Scandinavians, lots of people from European countries, not so many people from Africa, not so many people from the Caribbean, not people from a variety of other places. And so as a result, they were talking about their diversity gains that they were able to make, even though then the complaint was that the Winter Olympics team, at least the U.S. team, was overwhelmingly white. And Jason Thompson, who is the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, he is part of what's called the Director of Diversity for the U.S. Olympic Committee, said to the Post, "We've just been trying to find ways to make sure our team looks like America." So instead of saying, okay, we brought in a few more that aren't Anglos because that's just is not a sport. These sports are not ones that tend to draw individuals for obvious reasons, because you have to have access to an ice rink if you're an ice skater. You have to have access to snow if you're a snowboarder or a skier. Just think this through for a minute. There's some obvious reasons for that. And so anyway, John Moody, again, vice president of Fox News, said, in the Olympics, let's focus on the winner of the race, not the race of the winner. And so he noted that there had been no plans to fix the disparity in, say, the National Basketball Association, where there 81% of the players are African American. Others noted that there was an understandable reason in terms of geography and interest level and all of the rest. And as a matter of fact, he said in this year's Winter Olympics, 4% of the U.S. team was African American, while 13% of the general population is African American. But he pointed out that in the recent Summer Games in Rio, 23% of the U.S. team was African American. So on one case, it was 10 points higher. In the other case, it was, about 9 points lower. So then went on to make the statement that got him all sorts of trouble, because he said, unless it's changed overnight, the motto of the Olympics since 1984 has been faster, higher, stronger. It appears the U.S. Olympic Committee would like to change that to darker, gayer, different. If your goal is to win medals, that won't work. Well, you can imagine the firestorm that took place after that. Gay rights groups got upset, and others called him homophobic, racist, and all the rest. And, we've seen some of the reaction. And if you don't, just type in John Moody and the Olympics, and you will see lots of them. But let's go back to John Funn. Here's what he said. Commentary such as Moody's can be edgy and exaggerate matters, but are they the work of bigots and racists? A lot of people think the racist label is being used too loosely and too often. The dictionary tells us that racism is a belief that one race is superior to another. But now the charge is hurled at any perceived slight or criticism of people of color. In the theater of the absurd, TV personality Chelsea Handler called Housing Secretary Ben Carson a black white supremacist last year. Carson's apparent sin is being a conservative while black, as opposed to most blacks who vote for the Democratic candidates. And John Fund is saying, at least can you see the insanity of that? Not that, of course, Chelsea Handler is the best example of commentary, but nevertheless, he goes on to talk about other people that have labeled Donald Trump in that regard. And then he says, it's time when liberals recognize just how poisonous and conversation-ending a reckless charge of racism could be. He talks about one individual, Don Bunzel, a Democrat who serves on the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights, again, individual that has been in that position for a while, wrote that we should end the corruptive usage of the word racist. He says it breeds bitterness and polarization, not a spirit of pragmatism and pragmatic reasonableness in confronting our difficult problems. And then he also quotes from Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, of course, was a pillar of the Democratic Party and a U.S. Senator until 2001 and was replaced by, of course, Hillary Clinton, who identified just how damaging the misuse of the racist label was and used that even later when he served as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, in which even words like Zionism and racism were overused. Now, John Fund ends by saying something I think very positive. He says, very few Democrats have shown the courage of some of these individuals in decrying the use of racism, but one who has is Mark Lamont Hill. Now, maybe you've seen him on Fox News. You've certainly seen him on MSNBC. You've seen him on CNN. He's a professor at Temple University. And Mark Lamont Hill, although African-American, said this: "It's very rare that I call someone racist," he told the Philadelphia Magazine. "It has to be so unambiguous, like some white supremacist leader. I just don't find the term productive. It cripples the conversation. No one wants to discuss the matter with you after you use that word." And he's right. So if nothing else, one of the things that John Fund ends with is he says, I wonder why our conversations become so stilted and so unable to incorporate language that helps us solve problems. Let's acknowledge that crying racism in today's political theater is sure to create both more smoke and more fire. Before it gets worse, let's have as many people of goodwill as possible declare that, for at least a bit, we should stick to the dictionary definition of racism. After all, dictionaries exist for a reason. Let's use them to clear the air. So again, some things surfacing out of the Olympics. So if you have some comments about that, our last half hour, an open line, 1-800-351-1212. Also want to get into the scandal, which we've avoided until now, and that has to do with Rob Porter, individual that served until recently in the Trump administration, has been accused of abusing two of his ex-wives, and the way in which a lot of people have reacted to that, including the president himself. And so I wanted to get into that and get some of your comments about what do we do and how do we react when an individual has been accused of abuse or sexual activities or other things. Is there a reasonable way to respond? We'll talk about that, but we'll also take your phone calls if you'd like to join us. 1-800-351-1212. We have a lot of issues on the table. We'd love to hear from you right after these messages.
From PureFlix comes Samson, the biblical story of the last of the Hebrew judges. From his anointing to betrayal to redemption.
My name is Samson, and you will face the wrath of God.
Samson, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters February 16. More information is available at samson.movie.
Missing a day of Point of View is like Samson losing his hair. Now stay with me. Without his hair, Samson was weak, and ultimately he lost his sight. Without Point of View, you miss out on encouraging news, stories of how God is using Christians to make a difference. Instead of being strengthened, you get discouraged. And Point of View helps you see places to get involved, opportunities to apply your God-given gifts for good. Never miss a program, a Viewpoints commentary, an important action item when you download the Point of View radio app, free from Google Play or iTunes. Take out your phone right now and download the Point of View radio app. See the difference you can make.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
About a half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me come to the story here about Rob Porter. Now, this is an individual that has served for this last year as the White House staff secretary and has stepped down now from his post because both his ex-wives have accused him of abusing them. Now, the first point I want to make is that could be a problem with the way in which we have been vetting individuals in the Trump White House. And this is one of the reasons why some people have now called for the Chief of Staff, John Kelly, to step down. That may not be his problem, though, because the other day, Sebastian Gorka, who's been on the program with us before and served in the Trump administration, came out with something else, and that is he blamed the bureaucracy for maybe slow walking the clearance process. Now, again, you almost have to sort of get into the conspiracy view, and I'm not big on these conspiracies because I think sometimes when people say, is it a conspiracy or is it incompetence? I tend to land on the incompetence part, especially when I deal with massive bureaucracies. But it could be a conspiracy, and here's what he said. He was on the program, let's see, who was it with, Janine Pirro, and said that there may be a deliberate minefield put in place where they know someone like this has skeletons in their closet, and they slow roll everything to just make things like this explode a few months later. And so the point he was making is whether it's incompetence or whether it was deliberate, the president needs to take control over that. And, of course, the chief of staff, John Kelly, needs to as well. But I hadn't really thought about that until now, because you wonder, okay, this individual, again, an individual, Rob Porter, came into office January 20th. It wasn't until, a week ago, supposedly, we found out, or at least supposedly John Kelly, chief of staff, found out that he had been abusing two of his wives when they say they had reported this to, and, the various people asking questions, FBI, CI, things like that. And that is possible that it never got passed on. But there's a bigger issue that maybe we can learn from for just a minute, and then I'll take some phone calls, and that is, how should we react when we have these allegations? And there have been some articles, and this one comes from Associated Press, that points out that there is a natural inclination from the president, Donald Trump, that whenever somebody has been accused, he believes the man and not the woman. In other words, he believes that they have been falsely accused. Now, that may be due to the fact that he feels he has been falsely accused as well. But let me just give you a couple of examples and then see what you think. When, of course, this broke out about Rob Porter, he said, I wish him well, he's worked hard and everything else. But he says, I think you have to remember that he said strongly yesterday that he's innocent. Okay. When she says something like this, that I've been abused, and by the way, shows some pictures, and then the president is willing to say, I still think that Rob Porter may be innocent, that's an issue. Let's go back a couple of months. Remember the issue with Roy Moore? You remember back in November, Donald Trump again supporting for a while the Alabama Senate candidate Roy Moore. He said he totally denies it. He says it didn't happen. And look, you have to look at him also. And so, again, some of the questions that surfaced then. Even earlier, you had the allegations against Roger Ailes of various women coming out against him at Fox News. What did Donald Trump say? Well, some of the women that are complaining, I know he's helped them even recently. And so, again, he had some questions about that. Or Corey Lewandowski, former campaign manager, had charges of battery. And Donald Trump said, well, how do you know those bruises weren't there before? And even with Bill O'Reilly, I'll finish off with this one because there are more I can give you. He's a good person. I think he shouldn't have settled. Personally, I think he shouldn't have settled. And so there is a tendency sometimes for this president, and I think for some others, to say, when in doubt, believe the man, disbelieve the woman. And I think that's one extreme, that when these stories come out, really, indeed, we've got to reject those. There's the other extreme that has surfaced because of the Me Too hashtag, and that is whenever a woman says this, she always should be believed. No, I can't really go to that extreme either. I think the preponderance of evidence goes in that direction. In the case of Rob Porter, you have two women that have actually been married to him. We have photographic evidence. I think we should believe them. But in every case, do I believe them? I mean, if you were actually thinking about this, you recognize that sometimes in divorce courts, allegations of abuse, allegations of you've sexually molested my children. Sometimes people will lie in a court of law. Sometimes people will lie when they make those statements. And so, again, we have to not err on one side, which says, well, innocent till proven guilty. Well, that is true. You know, with the exception of, Bill Cosby and a few others, most of these never end up in a court. So, yes, that is true. But does that mean we can't make a prudent judgment about whether or not the allegations that these women are bringing forward is true? Of course, they should be taken seriously and investigated. But at the same time, I see the other extreme, which is starting to develop, that says we would never believe that anybody would ever lie about this. Well, I believe in human depravity, too. So when we have these cases, we certainly have to have enough of an open mind to evaluate it. But I think there is a real danger, which the president seems to be stepping into, of saying, well, I just have trouble believing that. He said it's not true, so I'll believe him rather than her, especially when we have evidence. So I'd love to get your comments about that. And, of course, we've also talked about this issue of the charges of racism being raised and a variety of other things in the Olympics, which I hope will not take away from some of the outstanding performances that have taken place. But let's go to some phone calls and get some of your comments. Start out in Maine, WSEW. Bob, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Hi, I think you covered it very well just now, but I had a thought in the sense that a lot of these accusations of racism and or sexual problems or whatever, they're kind of like a one-way street. In my understanding, they come from these people that are actually feminists and maybe some of the other people calling racism or whatever. They're aspiring to be like the stereotype men that I don't believe is actually a fair stereotype, that they're aspiring to be like them. If you get my drift, I don't know if I formulated that correctly or not.
So, again, you're looking both at the issue of racism as well as some of the issues of sexual harassment, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so I'm kind of putting two of those together. They are separate issues, but, that is certainly the case. And part of the reason for that really goes back to the university campus, and that is the argument that has been made in this idea of multiculturalism and especially political correctness is that a victim cannot be charged with sexism. A victim cannot be charged with racism because racism comes from people who have power over you. So it's males or it's white people. And so as a result, some of that has played itself out. And like you said, it is sort of a one-way street. Individual who is an African American, according to this kind of political correct theory that comes out of some of this postmodern multiculturalism. I'm not going to get into all the philosophers that say that really it's a use of power. And so you have power over someone else. So you can be accused, as let's say you're a white male, of racism. You can be accused of sexism. But an individual that comes back and calls you racist or sexist, you can't call them that, even if they are racist or sexist, because, after all, they're the victim in the first place. So sometimes people wonder, why is it a one-way street? Well, you got to go back to read some of the great philosophers who have made the case for the fact that it really is a one-way street, and that's how it really plays out in our popular culture, isn't it?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Kerby.
I appreciate you calling, and let's open up for some more phone calls after the break. When we come back, if you want to comment on a couple of those issues, certainly I will take those on, but I also wanted to get to the last two articles we have posted today. We're moving closer to another one of these crises because you might remember on March 5th, that's not that far away, the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, expires. Does that mean on March 6th that President Donald Trump and ICE and everybody are going to be deporting all those individuals? I think not. But this has led to a real sense of intensity about this immigration debate. And I've posted two articles, one that comes from The Stream by Rachel Alexander, who's been on the program with us before, entitled Immigration Debate Proceeds as Senator Langford and Faith Leaders Urge Action. So it talks a little bit about some of that. And then another piece by Arthur Shaper, who's called this piece The True Biblical Response to Illegal Immigration and Dreamers. So we'll get into some of that, but we'll take some more of your phone calls too. 1-800-351-1212. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. News out of Minneapolis reports of an aspiring teen boxer granted a religious accommodation. Amaya Zafar is a 16-year-old boxing protege that for some time has had her sights set on representing the United States as a boxer at the 2020 Olympics. But current rules place her in the position of having to choose between her faith and her sport. USA Boxing, however, has solved the problem for the St. Paul teenager by accommodating her faith in the ring. As a result, Zafar will be permitted to keep her arms and legs covered with long sleeves and leggings as her faith requires. That's a simple solution, and while I don't share Zafar's religious beliefs concerning clothing, I do support efforts by anyone, USA Boxing included, to take reasonable steps to respect the religious beliefs of Americans whenever possible. Of course, Zafar is not the first boxer to need a religious accommodation. Cassius Clay, better known as Muhammad Ali, famously asserted his religious beliefs as grounds for conscientious objection to the Vietnam War. In other sports-related cases, we are working to protect the right of Coach Joe Kennedy to pray silently at the 50-yard line when the game is over. Meanwhile, in Florida, we are defending the right of a football team at a Christian school in Florida to be able to pray over the loudspeaker prior to kickoff. As these stories remind us, religious liberty impacts every area of our life, including sports. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking just a minute ago about this particular case of Rob Porter, but broadening it a little bit to say, on the one hand, we don't want to dismiss out of hand allegations. On the other hand, we don't want to accept all of them as true, and sometimes that's difficult because some of us would like to have it black and white. And I just think we have to live in this world where we need to ask some additional questions. And our next caller wants to ask some of those questions. So I appreciate the need for us to develop some discernment and maybe even think about how to react to when we hear some of these allegations that have been brought forth to everybody from Rob Porter to, of course, Judge Roy Moore, Roger Ailes, Corey Landowski, just a couple of ones that we gave as examples. So let's go to Missouri, KNEO. Ann, what would you like to add as some things to think about when these particular cases surface?
Well, my first thought in this particular case was, where were these women, these ex-wives, when this happened? Is there documentation that local law enforcement was called or it was reported to anyone? It really concerns me, the timing, because every time it seems like President Trump is ready to roll out another part of his agenda, some of this surfaces. And I'm a woman, and I'm all for protecting women, But I just do not understand this timing. Do you know if there's any documentation that they reported it at the time?
Well, they say that they had reported it to the federal authorities, which brings me back to the comment by Sebastian Gorka. Now, I don't want to head too far down the conspiracy rabbit hole here. Okay, so I'm not necessarily agreeing that it's that the case, but he's made the case that maybe some of these individuals that did the background investigation for this individual, Rob Porter, just held it back. And so as a result, then it blows up kind of in a minefield right about now. And so if indeed you believe there's a deep state, if you indeed believe that there are people that want to still in the government to embarrass the Trump administration, that may be one answer to your question. Then, of course, the other one, as I think you're broadening it to the others, why is it that we've had these individuals that known about this for year after year and never said anything, and then only at the, quote, the most convenient time is it brought out? So that's another really important question about that as well.
Well, it could be a matter of greed. You know, there's plenty of money floats around, and I don't want to get any of my female friends mad at me, but I just, I'm a black and white person, and I think that if they were violated, there should have been some big explosion then. And when do you report something to the federal authorities? You know, when you're violated, you start out at your local level, I would presume. It just doesn't smell good to me, and it just seems to me like there's someone always trying to throw President Trump off track.
Well,
and,
that could be part of that. And again, I wanted to broaden it because there are some other issues there as well. But there's another topic that we've raised before, and that is, if indeed you have a serial abuser, and we can look at Harvey Weinstein, we can go through Louis C.K., we can go through, Kevin Spacey, whatever it might be, when someone doesn't report it the first time, then it increases the likelihood it will happen the second, the third, and the fourth, and the fifth time as well. So there are all sorts of other aspects of that. But let's take a few more phone calls here as well. We'll go to Joel in Texas. Joel, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. What would you like to add to our conversation?
Good afternoon, and thanks for taking my call. Firstly, when you started out, you seemed to skew it a little bit more towards Trump completely disbelieving all the women accusers. But the examples you raised of his responses were actually a little bit more towards the center.
Yeah, maybe.
Also interesting.
Okay, go ahead.
Also interestingly, you brought up the Roger Moore case, which is, frankly, I haven't been able to find any substantive evidence on that at all.
Yeah, first of all, it would be Roy Moore, but again, I'm talking about what he said during those allegations, and it has been interesting because, now that Roy Moore is not running for the Senate, we haven't heard about that much since then, have we?
Yes, in some cases that's simply because it's not news. You know, if it doesn't lead. On the other hand, nothing was ever found on any of the allegations. Basically, the only thing that you can establish from what was said was that when he was younger and unmarried, as in his 30s, he liked younger women, which is not exactly that's definitely not a crime. But as far as the actual allegations of sexual assault and whatnot, none of those were substantiated. Matter of fact, frankly, with the lady with the yearbook, first off, she
that was
had an
fake,
geister look.
Right.
And secondly, it was obvious that it was a forgery.
Right, and we talked about it probably being a forgery in the beginning. The point I'm making is more than just a Donald Trump issue, but you don't want to get to a point where you say, I just can't, they all do it for money, or I can't believe any of those comments. But on the other extreme, we certainly don't want to, what we're starting to see more and more is just have individuals saying, I can't believe that anybody would lie. I can live in that world. And so it puts us in that position of gray that is a little more difficult, but where we have to ask some additional questions. But let me take one more phone call real quickly before we run out of time. Chuck in Texas, I think you have some comments, so go for it.
Yeah, well, I think the guy probably did it myself. I mean, I don't think, with pictures showing that the women were battered and, a certain amount of notoriety comes whenever you make a public public statement like that, and you don't do it lightly. So I don't think they were doing it lightly. But at the same time, I think other people might be using this to make Donald Trump look bad. But it's responsibility falls on Mr. Porter, because if he did that, he's not demonstrating a very Christian-like example
well said.
As a husband. Because
what about John Kelly? He's the chief of staff. They're talking about firing or letting John Kelly go, and I'm thinking, is it possible that it was not passed on to him until recently, or did they know and turn a blind eye? That's, I guess, the big question that we'll have to ask over the next couple of days.
I think John Kelly's been a 4-star general. He's been in the military his whole life. He's not going. Nothing's going to get. He's going to do the right thing when it comes down to it. And I think it was. I don't think he knew the full situation at the time, or he would have made a different decision. But the point is, Mr. Porter, he's not demonstrated. And if you love somebody, you demonstrate it by your actions, not your words. And, you put their interests ahead of your own. And he didn't do that.
Well, good point. Wish I had more time. We've got more phone calls and we have time. A lot of those calls come in at the last minute, and we will certainly give you an opportunity tomorrow if you'd like to join our conversation, because certainly there are a lot of other issues to talk about. Didn't get into the one on immigration, but we'll have in studio tomorrow Andy McQuitty, and he has a new book out, and then we're going to have Rebecca Crownover in, and that is a new movie coming out, and so we'll spend some time looking at that. Of course, Wednesday is our Millennial Roundtable, and by the end of the week we'll have our Friday weekend edition. So lots of issues on the table. If you would like to read the pieces on immigration, we haven't gotten to those today, but we've posted them on the website. And just a reminder that when we sometimes pull a verse out of context in the Bible to justify our position, maybe we need to do a little more thinking. I think these two pieces will give you an opportunity to think that through. I want to thank everybody who's been a part of this today. If you did not have a chance to hear the conversation we had with Tom Holladay in the first hour, the book is entitled Putting It Together Again When It's All Fallen Apart. So, again, great resources available at the website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and formed.